Alright, let's see if we're working. Looks like we're connected. Ooh, I have to start my timer. Looks like we're connected to YouTube. I think it's going. We got a swirly signal. Oh yeah, looks like we're going. How about that? Hello and welcome to another live stream. We're here. We're just going to do a simple question and answer today. We have some questions about Applied Channel Theory by Wang Juyi. Ooh, autofocus works. Applied Channel Theory by Wang Juyi, one of my favorite books about Chinese medicine. A couple people asked some questions about those, about the rhythm of the Tai-yin channel, the spleen's role in moving the qi. So we're going to talk about the spleen and the lung and how those contribute to moving the qi. And then just if anybody else has any other questions. So if you have any questions, if you're here live, you can put them in the chat. Sometimes it helps if you put like 4 question marks before it or type question in all capital letters. It makes it easier to see. If you're here on the replay and you have a question that we couldn't get to, go ahead and leave it in the comments and we can answer it next time. That's where a lot of our questions come from. And if you're here live, let me know where you're watching from. I'm just gonna boop this closed. I don't need that. I don't have my music going. My microphone's working. Sandeep is here from Berlin. Hi, from Berlin. Guten Tag. Love your show. Awesome. It's cool. It's always cool when people come from different parts. Corey Brown is here from Illinois. I might have asked you this, but where in Illinois? I used to, I did my undergrad at Urbana-Champaign. So, and actually my parents live outside of Urbana-Champaign. So when I go home for the holidays, I go home. Met it from Louisiana. Awesome. So some people from all over. It's been a long week. I need more caffeine. I didn't have enough coffee this morning. And then let me know. I think people are starting school this week. Either this week or next week. So let me know if you're starting the new semester and how that's going for you so far. I think in Colorado, some people are starting this week. In California, some people are starting this week. Lombardy. I'm not sure I know where that is. Lombard, Illinois. I'm not sure I know where that is. I mean, it's kind of like, I don't know, some people are like, oh, I'm from south of Chicago. It's like, that's all of Illinois. Sorry, headphone users, I'm choking on my tea. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. If you have any questions, go ahead and leave your questions. But let's talk to, let's answer some questions. Corey left some good questions in the comments last time, so let's talk about those. Let's see if I have them here. So here we have, this is about Applied Channel Theory by Wang Juyi. I really like this book. I recommend this book. If you want to get this book, you can get it, if you go to the website, you can just get it on Amazon, but if you go to the website under book recommendations, it's the first one there, Applied Channel Theory in Chinese Medicine. So if you want to pick that up, this is like my most recommended. I would say that every acupuncturist should read this book. But here we have some questions about the spleen and the lung and the Tai-yin channel, because Wang Juyi is really into talking about the rhythm of the spleen channel, and he really likes his point combination lung 5, spleen 9, so let's talk about that. There's a question, can you clarify what Applied Channel Theory is trying to say when considering the spleen's ability to move qi, which is something we don't really talk about a whole lot. I understand that the spleen transforms and provides nutritive qi, fluids, transforms dampness. But it seems like the spleen has a role in moving nutrition around the body, while at other times it seems like you're saying the lung and heart work together to move the qi. And yeah, it's true. Like this happens with a lot of processes in TCM physiology, that we have multiple systems contributing to a physiological process. So it's kind of like, yeah, all these things do contribute. I'm not really understanding how the qi is involved, how the spleen is involved in movement of nutrition other than providing nutritive qi. And yeah, that is a little bit weird. And then we have kind of a follow-up about the lung, the rhythmic function of the lung moving qi. So yeah, that's kind of an interesting question. How do I make this go away? My buttons are in a different place. So that's kind of an interesting thing. And so first, maybe we'll tell a story. I'll start out by saying, let me minimize this. Sorry, I'm having computer problems. So first, I'll kind of tell a story that I remember when I was in my first or second semester. I went to the office hours of one of my teachers, and he was my fundamentals teachers, but he was also the dean, the academic dean at the time. And so I went in and asked him questions. I don't actually remember what question I asked him, but I was asking some really weird, convoluted questions about things in Chinese medicine. And so I asked him this question, and he just kind of looked at me and was like, to be honest, I don't really know. And that's kind of like the reason I don't know is probably has to do with the fact that it's not really clinically applicable. That it's a very good theoretical question, but when it comes to uh, using a treatment on a patient in the clinic, this is just not a thing that really comes up. Then he went on to say that I'm sure the answer to your question exists. It just might be that you have to learn classical Chinese in order to find that answer. And I actually really respected that answer. That was Bob Dimone. He's the same person who wrote that book that we had last week about andrology and men's health. I don't have it within arm's reach of me. But I actually really respected that answer, that he was just able to say, I don't know, because it's not clinically applicable. And I like that because that's something that didn't happen very much as I went through the rest of my program. That a lot of times with other people, when I would ask them a question, instead of saying, I don't know, they would just kind of make something up and pretend that they knew what they were talking about. It's kind of like when you get into clinic, people have the saying, if you don't know what you're doing, fake it till you make it. Just act confident and other people will believe you. And I think that's unfortunate because a lot of people, like 20 years into their career, they're still faking it and trying to make it. And so I just want to say that. I want to say thank you, Bob Dimone. That was a really good answer. That I really. It's like when he said that, I don't know the answer to your question. It's not like I was like, oh, you should know. You're supposed to be an expert. I want my money back. I need a refund because you obviously don't know what you're talking about. I was actually really able to respect him, that I was answering a weird question and he was able to say, I don't know the answer to that. It exists somewhere, but let's be honest, it's kind of a weird question. I don't know the answer. So, and that's something I tried to emulate as I went through school, or as I started teaching. That I want to say that if I didn't know the answer, I was just going to say, I don't know, rather than trying to make something up. So I guess that's kind of where we're going with this question is, that's maybe what we can say is, sorry, get rid of that. I'm not entirely sure, and so I'm just going to be kind of guessing and giving my opinion on some of this. I'm not really sure. Some of this I should just say I don't really know the answer to this, partly because it's not really clinically applicable. Because here we're talking about the ability of the spleen to move qi. And that's not really something we talk about clinically very much, especially if we're doing if we're in Zhang Fu pattern diagnosis. We would never have a patient come in and be like, oh, this patient has spleen qi stagnation. That's not really a thing. I don't think we have a lot of points that say, that have the function, oh, this point moves spleen qi, or we don't have herbs that they say we move spleen qi stagnation. Usually when we regulate the middle jiao, we're talking about something very specific. We're not talking about systemically moving qi throughout the body. We're talking about specifically moving things in the middle jiao. So that's kind of an interesting question there, that we're kind of getting into some weird theory that I'm just kind of guessing. The other thing is, I think there is a Facebook group for applied channel theory, that I think some of the people who moderate that group are people who studied with Wang Juyi, so it might be good to ask him some questions, or you can find that Facebook group and ask some questions on there. They might be able to have, they might have some better answers than what I can tell you. Oh, it's warm here. I'm getting pit stains already. Should have worn a different shirt. It's really hot under the lights in Colorado. So anyway, We're going to get back to the hot and sweaty YouTube videos. This is like when I was in California. I did all my filming in a loft upstairs, and so it was like 90 degrees during the day. Starting to feel that in here. So anyway, getting back to this, what do we mean by the spleen's ability to move the chi? So a lot of times when we talk about movement of the spleen, like on the one hand we say that the spleen has a function of transformation and transportation, or movement and transformation, or people say the T and T of the spleen. And I think a lot of times when people say that, they assume that means transforming and transporting. They think that means dampness. And while that's true that the spleen does have a function of transforming dampness, we can talk about separately movement of transformation. We're talking about the movement of transformation of the chi of water and grain. And so we're kind of talking about digestion. Then when we say the spleen transforms, we're talking about the rotting and ripening of the food. And transporting means that after we extract the nutrients from our food, the spleen sends it to where it needs to go. And so that's kind of an interesting process that Wang Juyi talks about this as. Classically, we thought of this as the spleen is sending the flavors to the different organs. So kind of a modern idea of digestion, we think about breaking down the nutrients and absorbing the nutrients. But the classical interpretation of this is the spleen breaks down the 5 flavors. You say the spleen issues the 5 flavors. So it's like it's sending the sour flavor to the liver, and it's sending the salty flavor to the kidney, and it's sending the bitter flavor to the heart, and so on. So when we talk about the movement and transformation of the spleen, that's part of what we're talking about, is moving these 5 flavors. After the chi of water and grain has been broken down, we have to move it to where it needs to go. We also talk about this movement of the spleen as like the spleen and stomach have an upward and downward movement, that after the food is rotted and ripened, the stomach down bears the food into the small intestine, where the spleen up bears the clear chi to the chest. And I think after you extract that chi, it goes up in the chest where it mixes with the chi of the lung, and it does something in the heart, and it becomes ancestral chi or zong chi. So that's kind of what we're talking about with the movement of the spleen as well, that there's this dynamic of the spleen moving up with the stomach moving down. So that's something we can kind of say about the movement of the spleen. But I think that's not what we're really talking about here with this question. With this question, we're saying what it has to say with the spleen's ability to move chi. We're talking more about the systemic movement of chi throughout the body, not necessarily just the dynamic of the spleen chi. And I think in this book, Wang Juyi actually uses the term xing qi. Xing means to move. Like when we say the heart moves blood, we say xing xue. Here he's saying the spleen moves the qi. So how does the spleen move qi? Because this isn't something we normally talk about. Again, if we had a patient coming in, we usually talk about moving qi with the liver. A person has liver qi stagnation. You have depressed qi. We're going to say, oh, the liver is failing in its function of free coursing. So kind of what he says about this is that it's the spleen's function of nourishing that helps move the qi. So by the spleen, by providing nutrition or by nourishing in the body, that has some aspect of creating movement. And this sounds kind of weird, but one way I might think about it is, remember we have this saying that the chi is the commander of blood, and blood is the mother of chi. And that sounds like when you're in your first semester, that sounds really confusing. You're like, what the hell does that mean? Chi is commander of blood, blood is the mother of chi. What do we mean by that? So when we say the chi is the commander of the blood, we mean that it's the motive force of the chi that allows the blood to move or propels the blood. So the chi is providing the energy for the movement of blood. When we say blood is the mother of chi, this one's a little bit more confusing. When we say blood is the mother of chi, that means that we need the nutrition from the blood in order to create chi. So this is kind of like an interdependence of yin and yang, where yin generates yang and yang generates yin. Yin controls yang and yang controls yin. Qi is the mother of blood, and qi is the commander of blood, and blood is the mother of qi. We're kind of saying there's this interdependence of yin and yang. And so it's kind of like the yin blood and the yang qi, there's this interdependence. And so We need the nutrition from the blood in order to create qi. And so I think this is similar to what's going on in the spleen, where we need the nutrition from the spleen in order for things to be able to move throughout the body. That basically, if you have poor digestion, if you're weak, if you're emaciated, your qi is not going to move. That if you don't have proper nutrition from the spleen, if the spleen is not nourishing the other organs, if the spleen is not nourishing the other tissues, then the qi is not going to be able to move. And so it's kind of a very indirect thing. It's not like when we say the heart moves blood, we're talking about the heart is a pump that physically pumps the blood around the body. That's not so much, at least my interpretation is that's not so much what we mean here. Here we mean more that the spleen, by virtue of supplying nutrition, the qi is able to move. I also think about this similarly to the function of the liver and the blood. Sometimes we say that the liver governs, because the liver governs free coursing. If the liver is deficient, it will fail in its function of free coursing. And this is why we use the formula Iguanjian, linking decoction. And the idea is you can tonify liver yin so that the liver can perform its function of commanding the blood, and the blood can, and qi and blood can move. And so it's by providing nutrition to the liver that it's able to perform its function of movement. And so I think the same thing here. It's like the spleen is supplying nutrition to the body so that this function of movement can occur. So it's kind of a weird roundabout way, and I'm not sure that's a great answer. I'm not sure that what I said is entirely correct. I could have just been pulling that all out of my ass and it's totally made up. But again, I think it's not so much of a direct movement the way that the heart moves the blood. It's more of an indirect, by supplying nutrition, the qi is able to move. I feel like there was more to that question. Oh, the other thing Wang Ji mentions is the spleen has a warming aspect, and so it's kind of like by warming the body, the qi is able to move. That there's this kind of correlation between warmth and yang and movement. And so it's the warming function of the spleen that moves things around. And so I would kind of think of this like when we talk about guizhi, cinnamon twig, we say that guizhi, it's a very warm herb, it's a yang herb, it has a function of movement and unblocking. But we don't necessarily say that guizhi invigorates blood. That's a bit strong. We don't really say that. Instead, we say that guizhi, by virtue of its warming and unblocking aspects, it's able to treat blood stagnation. Kind of like with the formula guizhi fuling wan. So we don't say that guizhi invigorates blood the same way that Chi Shao invigorates blood, or the same way that Wang Bu Liuxing invigorates blood by creating movement. But we're saying that by virtue of its warming yang nature, it's able to facilitate the flow of blood. And so I guess I kind of think about this in the same way with the spleen. That I don't really think of the spleen as a pump that pushes the qi along. It's rather the spleen, by virtue of its warming nature, it's able to provide that yang movement so that the qi can move. So I'm not sure that really answers the question, but again, it's kind of like this is a hard question to answer because we don't really have a lot of clinical applications for this. Again, I'm not sure I've ever diagnosed a patient with spleen, like systemic stagnation of qi due to something going on in the spleen. I guess that sounds kind of weird because we do diagnose people with middle jiao qi stagnation all the time. We have that that category of regulate qi, and we regulate middle jiao qi, but here we're usually talking about the upward and downward movement of qi through the spleen, more about with digestion when things feel stuck, and I feel like here we're talking about something different. We're talking about the systemic movement of qi throughout the body and the spleen's contribution to that. So maybe I'm making this more confusing. And then at the bottom we say applied channel theory also says that that all qi movement begins with the rhythmic lung function, but it doesn't end there. So what moves qi when the rhythmic effect of the lung loses its effect? I wouldn't necessarily say that when we say that the movement of qi begins with the lung, we're saying that there are a lot of different systems contributing to the movement of qi, and one of them, or one of the first, is the lung, but there are these other systems that play a role, and it's not like they're, with the lung craps out, they're going to take over. It's that they all play a role. That was really confusing. Let's talk more about that. When we talk about the rhythmic movement of the lung, I think here I think of breathing and qigong. That the rhythmic aspect is you breathe rhythmically in and out, and that inhalation and exhalation moves the qi around. That's what you're doing when you do tai chi and qigong, that the movement of the breath can affect the movement of qi. When the qi gets erratic, you might be breathing heavily, or you might be out of breath, or if you get like real nervous, you get short of breath. That's a sign that the qi is not moving properly. If you're really nervous, and people say, oh, take deep breaths, and kind of controlling that rhythmic movement of your breathing is going to harmonize the flow of qi throughout the body. And so that's what we're doing with qigong. And so that's what we say when this movement of the qi begins with the lung. That's what we're saying, is that it's this movement through breathing. However, there are other things that contribute. We also say that the liver governs free coursing, and the heart, by moving the blood, the qi is going to move the blood. And so there are all these other systems contributing to the movement of qi, but the lung is just one of them. I think it's kind of the same thing with the blood. When we talk about the blood, we have all these things like, oh, the spleen controls blood, the liver commands the blood, the heart moves the blood, and all these different confusing things. And you're like, what's the difference between governing and controlling and commanding? It's really that all these systems play a different role in how blood is moved throughout the body. So we have the heart is like an actual pump that pushes the blood along, but then we have the liver that governs free coursing and keeps the passages open. But then we have the spleen that controls things and makes sure they don't leak out. That we say the spleen controls blood, we're talking more about holding it in the vessels. And so it's kind of like all of these systems work together, and they all have their own role in moving the blood. Same thing with moving the qi, that might be the rhythmic breathing of the lung that circulates the qi, but we also have the liver governing free coursing and all these other things going on. So that's what I'd say about that. And kind of a follow-up here. Page 79 of Applied Channel Theory states, while the spleen provides nutrition through the nutritive aspect of the blood, the lung is the ultimate source of qi in the fluids. Both the nutritive and qi travel in the fluids and on the way to the cells of the body. So here we're asking, what's the difference between nutritive qi and true qi? So this is kind of weird. I wouldn't get too hung up on this, but nutritive qi versus true qi. So usually this is kind of weird because a lot of times we have a lot of different words. Even in Chinese, there are a lot of different words. Not only do we have a lot of different translations, we have a lot of different words in Chinese. And usually when we say the true qi, the jun qi, or the zheng qi, we're just talking about all the good qi in the body. So we talk about the zheng qi, the upright qi versus the evil qi, or we talk about the true qi, kind of the clear versus the turbid. So normally when we say something like true qi or upright qi, we're just talking about all the good qi in the body. And this is kind of weird. I might be making this up because, again, this is something that I heard from a Chinese teacher once, and I might be misremembering it. But some people ask, what's the difference between the jun qi, the true qi, and the zheng qi, the upright qi, because a lot of times they're used interchangeably. And I believe what the answer to that is, they are the same thing, and they are used interchangeably. This is something that I remember in an herb class. A Chinese teacher told me that there's this weird thing in China that if somebody becomes emperor, once they become emperor, their name, whatever Chinese character their name is, it then becomes precedent that you can only use that character to refer to that person. And so this has become a weird thing where, like, certain herbs, they had to change the name because somebody became emperor and there was a word in the emperor's name that was also a word in this herb, so they had to change the name of the herb just so that there wasn't this conflict. And so this is something I read in a footnote of the Nanjing in a Paul Unshold. So I haven't really verified this anywhere else, and this is the only place I've seen this. But I think what he said was early in Chinese medicine, they used the term zheng qi to mean the upright qi. And this was just all the good qi. It was the zheng qi versus the xie qi, the evil qi. So that just meant all the qi in your body that's good and supposed to be there. However, in some dynasty, they got an emperor that his name was Zheng, and it was the same character. And so they're like, oh, we can't call it Zhengqi anymore because that's the name of the emperor. So they had to come up with something else. So they chose the word Zhenqi, the true qi, because it sounds similar and the character looks very similar. So after that, they started calling it the Zhenqi, the true qi. And so it was just like this division of they mean the same thing. They just had to come up with a different term so they didn't offend the emperor. And so that's part of that's just kind of a random Zhenqi versus Zhengqi, but I'm not sure that's actually relevant here. So if we look at the figure here, maybe this will be better. We're talking about the true qi of the lung and the nutritive qi in the spleen. And so basically in the lung we have the true qi versus the turbid qi. In the spleen we have the nutritive qi versus dampness. And so basically the way I would interpret this, because again, when we talk about the qi in the lung, we have a lot of different words for it. That when Nigel Weissman, when he talks about the qi from the lung, he calls it the da qi, the great qi, because it's a qi that comes from the sky, that comes from the air. The sky is really big, so we call it the da qi, the great qi, and that's a qi you get from the lungs. When you read Ma Chioche, he calls it the qing qi, the clear qi, that when you breathe in the clear. And so he uses the qi we get from the lung, he uses the term qing qi. So here I'm thinking, when he's talking here, when he uses the term true qi, he's really just talking about qi that comes from the lung. That other books might call this da qi or qing qi. And again, I don't know this for sure. This is just my interpretation. I might be totally making this up. So the way I would interpret this is we're talking about the separation of the clear and the turbid. So normally when people hear the term separation of the clear and the turbid, they think of the small intestine, which is true. The small intestine does have a function of separating the clear and the turbid, and it's the most famous function for the small intestine. But as Wang Juyi mentions, when you talk about the small intestine separating clear from the turbid, he's saying this is the continuation of a process that began in the spleen. So when you first eat food, it rots and ripens, and the spleen separates the clear from the turbid. The clear goes up, and it becomes qi. The turbid goes down into the intestines. And so when the small intestine separates the clear from the turbid, it's kind of picking through the pieces. It's like a dumpster diver that's going in and trying to pick out the last little bits of the good stuff. It's really the spleen was the first step in separating the clear from the turbid. We could also think of the lung having a function of separating the clear from the turbid. When you breathe in, it's like you breathe in the da qi, the good qi, and then you exhale the carbon dioxide. So it's like you're breathing in the good and exhaling the bad. So that's also a function of separating the clear from the turbid. So I think what he's talking about here is when he uses this picture, we're just talking about the different aspects of separating the clear from the turbid in these systems. It's just that he doesn't say clear and turbid. In the lung, he says the true qi is the clear and the turbid qi is the turbid. Whereas the spleen, he says the nutritive qi is the clear and the dampness is the turbid. But they're both kind of clear and turbid. So that's kind of how I would interpret that. I'm not sure that's actually what he means, but that's how I would interpret that. So, and then he talks about the qi of the fluid. I'm not entirely sure what he means by the qi of the fluids. That's something we don't talk about a whole lot, so I'm not entirely sure how to interpret that. If I were to say something, I'd just be making something up that sounds right. I don't actually know. So that might be something that we'd have to read something in classical Chinese in order to know more about the qi of the blood versus the qi of the fluids. And so I think the whole idea with this picture is that remember that the spleen and the lung are sources of postnatal qi. That we have prenatal qi that we inherited and is housed in our kidneys with the essence, but then we supplement that with postnatal qi. Our postnatal qi comes from the lung and the spleen. It comes from the air that we breathe in, and it comes from the food that we eat. And so the spleen and the lung are sources of postnatal qi, and both of them have some aspect of separating the clear from the turbid. When you breathe things in from the lung, we have to separate the clear from the turbid, basically the oxygen from the carbon dioxide. And when we get things in the spleen, we have to separate the clear from the turbid, basically the good stuff from the junk. Or we could say the nutritive qi versus the dampness. The dampness is going to be the turbid aspect that the spleen has to get rid of. So in both of these systems, there's this process of separating the clear from the turbid, and it's the clear from the spleen and the clear from the lung that go together to give us ancestral qi or postnatal qi or qi of the body. So that's what we're talking about there. Oh man, look, I've got these sweaty pits. Hopefully Mallory's here so she can make fun of me. She always makes fun of me about my sweaty armpits. So I don't know if that's very helpful. That's just me pulling stuff out of my ass about this. Yeah, sorry, all these weird questions. Yeah, and so sometimes like these are really interesting things to like think about and to read about, but sometimes we just have to have the separation of like. Sometimes they're hard to answer because they're not it's not necessarily something that comes up in clinic. So, but I think it's like kind of like if you're a scholar, this is the fun part, that the scholars like to look into this and read into this and debate about it and debate the different terminology. And then you have other people who are like, I'm just trying to make sick people feel better. And it's like they don't really care about all those arguments. There's like, I just want to stick needles in people and make them feel better. And sometimes there is some separation in there that the desiccated scholars like to argue these things. And so if you're a scholarly person, that can be really interesting. But I can understand that a lot of people are just clinicians and they don't really care about this. And I can understand that maybe it's not so relevant if you're just trying to get people to feel better. Sandeep, which is the best and easy to read book on the basic principles of acupuncture? Other people, let me know if you have recommendations, either in the chat or the comments. The one I usually tell people, let's see if we can find it. I usually recommend this one to people. The Web That Has No Weaver by Ted Kapchuk. Oh, geez, it's only $15. Look at that. Can we get a preview of it? Can you read the first chapter of it? I always like this look inside. You can kind of steal the book. So what are we talking about? Because sometimes I even recommend this to patients, that if people want to understand more, but they don't want a really technical book, but they want some further understanding of what's going on, a lot of times I'll recommend this book. And so we have, so this is kind of an introduction about the difference between Eastern and Western ways of thought. But yeah, it looks like he does go through a lot of our fundamentals, like Qi blood essence, Zong Fu theory, the channels, warp and woof. This is kind of a weird thing. We're using an analogy of weaving. I talked about this in the channel theory video a little bit, that we usually say channels or meridians, but some people use warp and woof because when you're weaving on the loom, the up and down threads and the horizontal threads are called the warp and the woof. So we're using this image of weaving silk. The 4 examinations. 8 principle diagnosis. So here we're going over some of our basics. And so that's something I usually recommend to people. But if you're here, let me know if you've read that, and if you think, it's been a while since I've read that book. I'm not sure I even read the whole thing. So if you've read that book, let me know if you think that would be a good introduction to Chinese medicine. can't really see your sweaty pits good. I like brought attention to it, and oh, see, I'm getting like sweaty front too. Ugh, this is terrible. And I'm just bringing more attention to it. It's like if I didn't say anything, people would probably never notice, and I'm just bringing more attention to it. I should have worn my black shirt. I feel like it was like snowing last week, and now it's 80 degrees. So let me know if you read that book and you think this is a good introduction, because what were we specifically asking? Basic principles of acupuncture. Yeah, that will give you some basic principles on channel theory and things like that. It's not going to get anything too specific like point combinations or things like that, but it is a good way to just get started on some of the overall theory, and I think it's a little bit more readable than a textbook. It's something you can sit down and read, and it's kind of interesting. It's not like opening a textbook. Like the first time I tried to read about Chinese medicine, and I opened Fundamentals of Chinese Medicine by Nigel Weissman, and I was like, oh my god, this book is so boring. I don't understand how anybody can read this book. So I think The Web That Has No Weaver is a little bit more accessible. It's a little bit more fun. Yeah, saying it's a good introduction. Yeah, I feel like a lot of classes sometimes recommend this book. Yeah, another one is Between Heaven and Earth. This one I read. I'm not quite as fond of this one. This is the one that they had a copy of this in India, and I read this one. So Between Heaven and Earth is another one. Written by a guide to Chinese medicine. So yeah, I think this is a good one, and it's also a little bit more readable. I just remember they used some weird analogy of the 5 elements that I didn't really like. Oh, this is really good. The doctor as a gardener, that's a really good analogy. I use that analogy a lot with my patients when sometimes they say that Western medicine is more like a car mechanic, where you find the problem, you say, oh, there's something wrong with my car. You use a series of tests to diagnose what the problem is. It's usually a part that's broken. You order a new part and you replace it. And as long as all the parts are working, that means your car is working. You're good to go. That's Western medicine. Eastern medicine is more like being a gardener, where it's like it's about creating balance. That when you have a plant, you want it to be everything needs to be balanced. Like I've killed a lot of plants by watering them too much. So when you have a plant, you have to give it water, but not too much water. You have to give it sunlight, but not too much sunlight. You have to make sure the soil is the right pH, not too acidic, not too alkaline. And so we're kind of creating that balance. And so you have to know how to read the signs. Like if you start looking at the leaves, and the leaves are a little yellowish, that might mean you're adding too much water. You need to cut back on the water. And so it's like we're trying to create a harmonized environment so that the plants will thrive. And that's kind of what we're doing with Chinese medicine. So that's what we talk about here. The doctor as a gardener, and it also requires knowing the signs. That you have to be able to look at a plant, look at the leaves, look at everything, and by those outward signs you can tell, oh, maybe the soil's too acidic. Oh, maybe some plants like direct sunlight, some plants like partial shade. I think this one we need to bring it into the shade, things like that. Yeah, but I think this is the weird thing where they talked about the 5 phases. Like fire is the wizard, and earth is the peacemaker. And I just thought that part was kind of weird and kind of a little bit too new agey for me. But that could just be me. But I think a lot of other people really like that book. So that's another one you could look at. And again, we're just talking about the kind of the general aspects of TCM theory. I don't think it has any really specifics about needle point. So there's some ideas for books. I'll look for any other questions. Any advice on what's important to take out of a Huangdi Neijing class? That's kind of hard to answer because I've taken Huangdi. It's kind of like the Huangdi Neijing is like a really big book, and it's kind of hard to focus on anything in one semester. So I think it kind of depends just on whatever they focus on in the class. Like when I went into it, we went into this really detailed discussion about the origins of yin and yang, and that was really interesting. We talked about In the first part, it has the 7 and 8 year cycles, so we talked about that and that kind of stuff. So I don't know, just maybe whatever they talk about in the class. Yeah, so, here Sandeep is saying he's looked at various sources, but I want to dive deeper now. Somebody suggested the Yellow Emperor, the Yellow Emperor's inner classic is the Huangdi Neijing. That's gonna be real. If you don't have a good foundation, that can be really confusing. I think even for students who have been studying for a while, just sitting down and reading the Huangdi Neijing is, one, it's really boring, but it can be really confusing. So that might be difficult. Because I feel like even something like this, applied channel theory, is a little bit more readable if you have some general concepts. And it's going to go more specifically into acupuncture. It's kind of like the Huangdi Neijing is like really abstract, and it's almost like you need a Chinese scholar to interpret it for you. It's kind of hard to just sit down, and if you just sit down and read it, it's probably not going to make a whole lot of sense. It's kind of like if you just sit down and read the Tao Te Ching, it's really abstract, and it's kind of like you have to have somebody who knows a lot about Taoism to kind of give you clues as to what's actually going on there. Here, Esteban is saying applied channel theory to treat patients. Yeah, and yeah, this is why I think that like every acupuncturist should read this book. I think it's a good book. It kind of expands on some of the basic stuff you learn in your points class. It makes it, but it's still like very readable. It's readable as a textbook, or it's readable as a normal book. So yeah, if you're like really new, I might start with The Web That Has No Weaver. If you've like looked into things a little bit more, I might go with, or if you're like in your first year of school, I might go with a lot more like applied channel theory. Here we're talking about burnout. They're saying, what are some ways to maintain your compassion and empathy towards your patients and profession long term? I'm not sure I'm the right person to be asking that question, because there are days when I'm like, I don't have a lot of empathy for my patients. I think we might have talked about this on the podcast. I'm not sure if I asked this question directly, and I think maybe it's something I should ask more people, but I think I've kind of said this on the podcast, where it's like some days you get people where it's like, what do you want from me? Like, you're creating your own problems, sort of thing. So I'm not sure I'm always the most patient or empathetic person. So burnout. It's like I moved to Colorado. I haven't seen any patients since I moved to Colorado. I've just been making YouTube videos, so I'm not sure I'm the best person to ask about burnout, because if I get tired of seeing patients, I just stop seeing patients and make YouTube videos instead. So I'm not sure I'm the best person to ask about that. I'll bring that up on the podcast a little bit more, that when we talk to practitioners, because somebody had a good question about like, how do you protect yourself from other people's evil chi, and so I've gotten some interesting responses from that. I'll have to ask people, how do you deal with burnout, or how do you deal with compassion, and how do you just not like fire all your patients and things like that. Here David is saying the Yellow Monkey Emperor's classic. Yeah, this is another one. I'm not sure if I still have this on my website or not. Boop boop-a-doo. Do I have this here? Yeah, this is the Yellow Monkey Emperor's inner classic. And so this is kind of fun. Here we can look inside, and maybe we can read the first couple chapters, because I think the first part is actually this is kind of funny. So in the Huangdi Neijing, it's a conversation between Huangdi, the Yellow Emperor, and his physician Qi Bo. And so here he's saying you have the Yellow Monkey Emperor, and Bibo is his physician. And so I think this first part kind of goes through a general introduction of some things about Chinese medicine. But then when it gets into it, it has these comics, these illustrations, and it's basically just going through all the Zong Fu patterns, and it's giving you some idea of what the Zong Fu patterns are. So it's actually organized by chapter. There's a chapter of all the liver patterns, there's a chapter of all the spleen patterns, and things like that. And he has a little comic that goes with each one. And then, yeah, liver qi. I'm not sure liver qi deficiency is a thing. I think maybe we talked about that before. I'm not sure that liver qi deficiency is a thing. I'm not sure that liver yang. This is a bad example. I'm not sure that liver yang. Usually when people say liver yang deficiency, they mean liver blood deficiency. But he gives some signs and symptoms. He gives a tongue and pulse, but it doesn't really have any points or herbs in it or anything like that. So this is just kind of like an overview of the patterns, but the introduction kind of goes through some stuff about Chinese medicine as well. So that's another option. And I do remember, like, I talked to some people about this book because when I first saw that book, I thought it was like the coolest thing ever. But I talked to people about it, and there were a lot of people who were like, "Yeah, I got that book because it looked really cute." I never actually sat down and read it though. So, what are your thoughts on Jingfang herbalism? I guess I'm not sure. Is Jingfang like a specific school of herbalism? I'm not entirely sure. Can you recommend a good translation for Shang Hanlun and or Jingui Yalue? I don't remember which one I have. And I wonder if it was. I'm not sure if it was like translated by if like Lorraine Wilcox worked on that too. And because I feel like the one I had, it might have been like with Nigel Weissman, and I'm not sure it was actually the complete text. So this is the one I have. Go away, you. Oh, sorry, I didn't realize my window was way too big. This is the one I have by Feng Ye. I'm not really familiar with Nigel Weissman. So this is the one I have. I think it's some translation and some commentary as well. So I think that's the one I have. And I feel like they did a Jingui Yalue too. Jingui. Here you go, Jingui Yalue. Who wrote this one? Oh, Sabine. Yeah, that's. Sorry, I thought Lorraine Wilcox. It's actually Sabine. She's a very good scholar, TCM scholar. So, those are the ones I have. I actually haven't looked into a lot of them, so I'm not sure what other ones are available. So those are just the ones I have. So maybe don't take my word for that. But I do. I generally like Nigel Weissman translations. A lot of people don't like Nigel Weissman terminology, but I generally like Nigel Weissman translations. Okay, yeah, because I was gonna say some people just say classical Chinese medicine, and that's how then they were referring to Shang Hanlun type stuff. I don't know. I mean, I think it's kind of like before we talked about different schools, and it's kind of like if you like it, if it speaks to you, and if it seems to work for you, go ahead and do it. I'd say there are different schools, and they all have their strengths, and you can do them. So some people are really into Japanese acupuncture. Some people are really into J.R. Worsley 5-element acupuncture. It's something that if you enjoy doing it, and you feel like it works well for you, then try it and do it. I would say the same thing here. Because it's kind of the same thing that some people have interesting. There are like a lot of different schools of thoughts about how to prescribe herbal medicines and how we modify formulas. Some people are like they never modify formulas. Some people say, oh, you should only modify formulas by combining two formulas. You have people who are really into compo medicine using smaller dosages, and so it's kind of like what different people try different things, and I don't want to talk shit about any of them. So there's I guess the fire school kind of weirds me out. I've known some people that they just give everybody futsa, and that kind of weirds me out. But I guess if it works, it works. Um, mm, 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 mm. So, and I think this also brings up I think I talked to Patrick about this on the podcast a few times about um, I think sometimes people have interesting applications of classical formulas and modern conditions. And we see that with a lot of like the Shanghan Lun formulas that Zhong Zhongjing used this formula for this very specific pattern, and then people expanded that to do other things like Chai Hu Jiao Long Gu Mu Li Tong. He was treating a very specific pattern, and now people are using it for like any sort of mental emotional pattern. We'll use Chai Hu Jiao Long Gu Mu Li Tong for schizophrenia and things like that. And like that's not really what Zhong Zhongjing was using it for. And so there are a lot of examples like that. And so sometimes it's interesting, like, are we actually using them the way that the classics did? Or are we reapplying them? And there's also this interesting thing of, can we still use some of those treatment methods in modern times? Like, do they still apply? Just because we're people who live in houses with air conditioning and aren't exposed to the elements, do those Shanghan Lun things still apply? Or when you have people are eating high fructose corn syrup and they're eating too much, is very different from people who had a rice-based diet. Do those same conditions still apply? So I think that's also kind of an interesting conversation to have. Like when we look at the formula, Jiawei Xiang Susan is a formula for just a common cold. And kind of the idea behind that formula was people didn't want to use Shanghan Lun formulas. They were like, all these formulas with Ma Huang and Guizhi, that's way too much. It's like, yeah, if you have an epidemic, if people across the country are dying because of this epidemic, yeah, those Shanghan Lun formulas work really well. If somebody just has the sniffles, giving them Ma Huang Tong or giving them Xiaoqing Long Tong, that's overkill. You're going to disperse their qi. That's way too much. So we're going to use this different formula. And so it's kind of like, it's an interesting thing of, do those 6 levels still apply if you're just like, if someone has a rhinovirus? So, boop, 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 boop. Do you think you're doing courseware that is focused on common pathologies most often seen in clinical practice? If I did that, I was thinking about doing that as like a CEU sort of thing, where it's like, right, most of the stuff on the YouTube channel is for like beginner students who are still in school. I was thinking that part of it is also like a business sort of thing, where it's like, I want to give free stuff to students because students are poor and broke and don't have any money, so I want to support them. But it's also like, I need to pay my rent. And so if I create CEU courses that are targeted at practitioners, then they have money and they can spend money on CEU courses. So if I did something like that, it's like last week we talked about erectile dysfunction. So I think it would be like interesting just to like make a whole course about going through the different patterns of erectile dysfunction. But I would probably make that as like a CEU course. So, I was also asking with that's acupuncture based. Eventually, it's kind of like I'm making a formula review course right now, and I want to get through that because again, it's like I need to pay my rent. But after that, I want to get back into doing more of acupuncture videos and fundamental videos. A lot of people have been asking me about fundamentals type stuff, just like yin yang, 5 elements, 8 principle diagnosis, things like that. So I'd like to make some more of those and just have them be free on the YouTube channel. But for the next while, I'm going to be focusing on making this formula review course. And it's taken a long time. I did the first chapter. And the video is 40 minutes long. It took me 2 weeks to make. So let's talk about that. So so that's something I just put. I'm making a formula review course, but I'm gonna be putting things on the Patreon as they go through. So I just posted that this morning, that we have the video for formulas that release the exterior. And so, like I said, it's a 40-minute long video, but it goes through all the formulas in that first chapter. And so basically we're going to try to go through all the formulas that are in the NCCUM list. And it turns out this is probably going to take a while. This is probably going to take a couple months to get through all those formulas. So as we're going through it, I'm going to post them all on the Patreon or on the community thing. We'll put them on both. And so if you want to like follow along as I'm making them, then I'll post them there. And then once everything's done, I'll package it into a course and put it on Teachable, and it'll be like $50 on Teachable with handouts and tests like that. But if you want to see it as it's being made, then that's going to be on the Patreon webpage. And also, I made this kind of like as a bonus for Patreon people. I tried to make this community website. This is innercircle.tcmstudy.net. This is kind of like a Facebook group, but it's not Facebook, so they're not going to steal your data or give you a bunch of ads. And so I've been trying to put more stuff on here. So if you're a member of that, I made a introduction thread. So if you're on the Patreon and you have access to the Inner Circle thing, you can go and introduce yourself and start talking on the community page, because I was kind of hoping, on the one hand, I want this to be a place where if people just want to ask questions, we can do like Q&A and study stuff, but also just as a place for people to talk to each other. So if you want to just go and talk to other people who are doing TCM, that's a place to do that. Sorry, I feel like I don't have a lot of energy. It's been a long week. I don't have a lot of energy this week, so I feel like I'm running out of steam. I'm hot and sweaty. I want to go eat pizza and watch Star Wars. So what are some things that we should remember about tie-in? Yeah, so I would think about tie-in. So when you say tie-in, we're saying lung and spleen. So I think about, tie-in, what did we say? Nutrition, chi movement, transforming dampness. Yeah, if you want to think about tie-in as a whole, I remember, since we're talking about both lung and spleen, we're talking about tie-in as the source of postnatal chi. So that's where we're getting the body's chi, is from the lung. We're breathing in air, chi from the lung, and we're getting the chi from the food. So I remember that. And both of those have a rhythm to it. I think that's what Wang Juyi emphasizes, is that there's this rhythmic movement. And you can think about that in terms of breathing, that when you do Qigong, you're doing rhythmic breathing to circulate Qi. You can also think that digestion has a rhythm to it too, that just like when you're breathing, your diaphragm is going up and down, there's also a peristalsis through the whole digestive system, and that kind of has to do with the rhythm of tie-in, and also just circadian rhythms in terms of digestion. Like if you eat at regular times, your body will actually secrete leptin and ghrelin and insulin. It will secrete all these hormones associated with digestion. They go up and down rhythmically as well. So there's this rhythm to it as well. Yeah, to some extent, chi movement, and again, normally when we think about chi movement, we might think of more of other systems, but there's a contribution to chi movement. And I would think a lot about water and dampness, because that's something, because everybody remembers that the spleen transforms dampness. We also have to remember that the lung plays a role in water metabolism as well. We say the lung regulates the water passages, and so that's why we have things like lung 5 regulates water metabolism, things like that. Also, maybe think about blood as well, just in terms of postnatal chi, but it's the nutrition of the spleen that forms the blood. It's that da chi that helps form the blood, that we say the spleen controls the blood, as in keeps it in the vessels, but we also say the lung faces the 100 vessels. So there's actually an aspect of blood in there as well. So those are some things I would remember. And then there's just that general idea of the tie-in you say it opens to the exterior. So the tie-in of the three yin levels, the tie-in is the most superficial, and so it's the tie-in has the most access to the outside. So it's kind of like your digestive system is connected to the outside world, and your lungs are connected to the outside world more so than like the liver and the kidneys are. So what are your thoughts on stone medicine? I'm not sure I know what stone medicine is. Stone medicine, it makes me think there's this passage in the Nanjing where it's like where it's talking about the eight extraordinary vessels, and it's talking about if there's heat evil in the eight extraordinary vessels, the way you treat it is you hit the person with a stone. No, I thought that was kind of funny, and just this image of it's like, you got heat in your chongmai, I'm gonna hit you with a stone. Turns out they really meant prick to bleed, I think. So I'm not entirely sure what that means. What are your thoughts on Jeffrey Ewan? He seems like a nice guy. I mean, I don't want to talk shit about anybody. He seems like a nice guy. He seems if those who don't know Jeffrey Ewan, he's a Taoist priest, and so I feel like we don't have a lot of people that following that kind of tradition, following that kind of lineage. We don't necessarily have a lot of people like that in our medicine anymore. So I think that's it's really good that we have that as a resource in our medicine. And so I think I don't want to be speaking for Jeffrey, but what I remember of when he introduced himself is he said he was a Taoist priest, and when you're like that, it's kind of like you study all of Taoism, but like you have to have a major. Like when you go to college, you have to choose your major, and that's kind of the same way when you study Taoism, that people have different specialties. Some people do martial arts and Tai Chi and things like that. Some people do like feng shui or divination. I think making talismans is one of them. And it turns out that traditional medicine is one of the majors or one of the specialties in Taoism. And so it's kind of like he's a Taoist priest, and Chinese medicine is his major or his specialty. And so I think that I've heard him talk a few times. He's really interesting to listen to. So I think just from that perspective, he's really interesting. I feel like he started doing some stuff with essential oils, and people gave him a lot of shit about that, but I don't know a whole lot about that. So crystals and gems, that's another one of those things. I'm not really into it, but I know people who are, and they say it works really well. So if it works for you, go ahead and do it. I think on the podcast, the second episode was with Gary Williams, and he's someone who he's an acupuncturist, but he also does Reiki, and he would do stuff with crystals, and it's kind of like, for him, that worked really well. His patients were really into it, and it worked really well. I know that there are going to be other patients who are not so into it. Some people want you to look like a doctor and wear a white lab coat and talk to you in medical terminology. Some people are really into the crystal stuff, and they're really into that kind of stuff. As far as, is it actually part of TCM tradition? I don't know. I think there was an aspect of the medicine that dealt with like making talismans and things like that, but I'm not sure if that actually involved crystals. I'm not sure to what extent that's part of the traditional medicine. And sometimes I feel like TCM gets blended in with new agey stuff, so I'm not sure if they're just like reaching and making these connections between the color of this crystal and the 5 phases. But I think there are some people, there might be some traditional aspects of that as well, and it just got lost with the whole Mao thing, or trying to modernize Chinese medicine. I think they got rid of some of that stuff, but I don't know a whole lot about that. Here's a more general run. What recommendations do you have for someone struggling to remember the herbs and the formulas? It might depend on where you are. Because Let me think about how to say this. Because my advice might be different. If you're like in a single herbs class, then I might be kind of like, oh, you just kind of have to memorize the herbs, make sure you know the category, things like that. Try to make some connections. I think it's a little bit easier when you get to formulas. That basically the way I like to think about formulas is make sure that a lot of people just look at the formula and try to memorize the formula and say that Ma Huang Tong treats these symptoms, that Guizhi Fu Ling Wan treats these symptoms. Usually I try to, looking at a formula, make sure, basically look at the formula, look at what the formula does, but then look at the ingredients of the formula and see how are the ingredients contributing to the actions of the formula. And so instead of just trying to rotely memorize this formula goes with this tongue and pulse, or this formula goes with these symptoms, try to think about how are the herbs contributing to the actions of the formula, and then try to make sense of it rather than just memorize it, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And so that's kind of, and that way you're kind of studying both, that it's like you're studying your formulas, but then you're reviewing single herbs while you're studying formulas. And then when you understand your single herbs, you can start to understand why it's in that formula. And so it's kind of like they go together. I feel like that wasn't explained very well. But basically, I never really liked memorizing things. And so if I could understand why something the way it was, it stuck better. Not everybody does it that way. Some people just make flashcards and they go through that this formula goes with this tongue and pulse and things like that, and they just memorize with flashcards. For me, I always had to go through and try to understand what's going on with a pattern. Why does this formula treat this pattern? How are these different herbs contributing to the treatment of this pattern? And so that's kind of what we went over with some of the formula videos. I think I have some formula videos on the website, and maybe it explains some of that. Like if we go to herbs, we have formulas. So there are a few formula videos, and that's kind of how I try to break it down here, and it is trying to say, how do these herbs contribute to the functions of this formula? So when you say Chen Tong, we're trying to deal with phlegm. And we can think about how do we deal with phlegm? Well, we can take a three-part approach to phlegm. That on the one hand, we can transform the phlegm directly with Zhibancha. On the other hand, we can drain dampness, because it's usually dampness congeals into phlegm. So if we use something like Fu Ling, that can drain the dampness. But then there's also this idea that by moving the qi, that can help move the phlegm, because if the qi is stuck, then the fluids are stuck, and the fluids transform into phlegm. So if we have something that moves the qi, then that can move the water and get rid of the phlegm. And so that's why we have Zhibancha, Chen Pi, and Fu Ling all together in our Chen Tong. So it's kind of like understanding the individual herbs and understanding the formula as a whole. We're getting to this point where I feel like I'm rambling, I'm losing my voice, I got sweaty pits. Maybe we need to call it a day. Starting to get grumpy too. Where's my window? Yeah, that's always kind of funny. It's like Woolinger. Yeah, so that's one of the things I bring up. There's because there's a lot of weird stories like that. Like there's this book, Chinese Medicinal Cures, and it goes through some of the stories of the herbs. And some of the stories are just like, oh, this guy had alternating fever and chills, and he got fired, and so he was homeless, and so he went and passed out in the swamp, and he was like delirious from the fever and chills, and he rolled over, and there was a plant there, so he just ate the plant, and then he got better. And that's how they knew that chai hu helped with alternating fever and chills. Or like with pears, I think there is some story about, it's like all these people got sick with this cough, except for this one family that owned the pear orchard, and so they figured out that pears are good for moistening the lungs. So some of them make sense like that. Other ones are really weird. Yeah, like Woolinger, who thought of that? There are references to like drinking the urine of a 12-year-old boy. Like, who was the first person to try that? I once came in India, somebody told me about this traditional cure of for hearing loss using turtle's urine. And it's like, who was the first person who was like, I'm going to put turtle urine in my ear and see what happens. It's like, who was the first person who thought about that? And I kind of wonder if it's just like the emperor had a lot of slaves and they just tried a whole bunch of different things and like threw a bunch of shit at the wall and to see what would stick. So I don't know. The other another was like Ren 1 to revive drowning. It's like, who is the first, when you say that Ren 1 revives a person from drowning, who's the first person who thought of that? It was like somebody fell over, was like, oh my god, they're drowning, and some guy was like, hold on, I got this, and they needled Ren 1. Like, who thought of that? Let me see if I can look up this book. Is it by Henry C. Liu? It's a big book with a red cover. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? It's like Chinese medicinal cures or Chinese food cures. I feel like it's a food therapy book that also talks about... I'm trying to find what book this is. I want to say it was by Henry C. Liu. I might be making that up. Here we go. Chinese natural cures. I think this is the book that... it's kind of a big book, and it talks a lot about food therapy, and it has a lot of the actions of foods, but there's like a middle section where he goes through some common herbs and has stories about, I don't have a look inside option. He goes through and gives some stories about the herbs. So it's about like Dong Wei means ought to return, and it's like this guy went into the mountains to get some herbs, and then there was a snowstorm, and he was stuck there for like 12 years, and when he came back, turns out his wife had remarried. And she was like, oh, you should have returned sooner, and that's why Dong Wei is called ought to return. I think not all the stories are true, but they're kind of fun. It's kind of like with... I remember there was one story about... recognize your mother. Zhimu. Zhimu means to know your mother or to recognize your mother. And so some people have this weird story about there was this son and he got estranged from his mother, but then when he became a doctor and then he met her again, but when he met her, she was like really sick and weak and kind of dried out, but then he recognized it was her mother and his mother, and he gave him Zhimu, and so Zhimu means recognize your mother. But then when you look in Bensky, it says like Li Shizhen, his story for it is Zhimu looks like maggots, and maggots crawling towards their mother, and so, or like larvae crawling towards their mother. So that's why it means know your mother or recognize your mother. It has to do with insect larvae recognizing their mother, and that's what the plant looks like. So different people have different stories. I think the ones in that book are a little bit more fun. So that was Chinese Natural Cures by, Professor Henry C. Liu. Sorry, my window's in the way. Boop, 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 boop. How much pharmacology is actually thought about when prescribing herbs? I think it depends. It depends on the person. I'm kind of not into that. I feel basically this is like when we talked about like when I talked to Patrick on the podcast, it's like we're a bunch of pretentious cunts who are like really into the traditional aspects of the medicine. And it's like when we were going through school, we'd say things like, Zhong Jing didn't have a stethoscope. Li Dongyuan didn't have a sphygmomanometer and things like that. It's like they did just fine. And so I kind of have that attitude. Whereas other people are really into that aspect, or they're really into the idea in terms of functional medicine or possible drug-herb interaction. So some people are really into that. I'm not so much into that. So I think it depends on the practitioner. To some extent, I think thinking too much about it is maybe the wrong way to go about doing things. Like we said before when we talk about integrative medicine, that some people are like, oh, this herb has an antibacterial effect. Therefore, like this person has a UTI and it's a bacterial infection. I'm going to give them this herb because it has an antibiotic effect. And like, if you're doing that, you're not doing Chinese medicine. Some people are like, oh, I'm going to prescribe this herb because it's good for lowering high blood pressure. And it's like, you should probably do a pattern diagnosis rather than just prescribing those kinds of herbs. So I think it depends on the practitioner. So I think some people are really into it. I would say I'm more of a traditionalist, and it's kind of like, that's interesting, and maybe that's a way I can explain it to the patients. But really, in terms of treating someone, I would think about how are we treating them in terms of TCM theory, not what are the constituent things in this herb. And so the Chen and Chen book goes into a lot of that, about the different research studies and different pharmacological effects of the herb. So I think that's kind of interesting to look at, but I wouldn't use that as the basis of herb selection. This is a good one. What are your thoughts on complementary channels, or sometimes we say secondary channels, like the sinew divergent 8 extra? Do you focus more on the primary? I think I focus more on the primary channels just because I don't know a whole lot about those other channels. And I think it's like, that's, first of all, I think there's just, at least until recently, I think maybe there's a lot of information in Chinese about those things, but it hasn't necessarily been translated into English. And so I think there have been recently some books on diagnosing and treating the divergent channels and things like that. But it's just there's not as much information on what happens to those. And so I guess normally, like, when you go through a normal points curriculum, it's kind of more like those channels exist to explain the functions of the points on the primary channel. So it's kind of like UB57 is good for hemorrhoids, and you're like, why would a UB point be good for hemorrhoids? Well, it's because the divergent channel goes to that area. And so we kind of just use it as a way to explain the points. I think Wang Juyi talks about some of that stuff a little bit in here too, especially about the 8 extras, thinking about them as sort of like the groundwater. And there's kind of a difference between, you have to be able to differentiate between, there are multiple primary channels that are afflicted, or is it actually the 8 extraordinary, one of the 8 extras that's afflicted? And so it kind of becomes more complicated. Yeah, Jeffrey Ewan goes on the 8 extra, yeah. And so I feel, is that Mikishima? Somebody wrote a book on the divergent channels or the 8 extraordinary channels. I'm not sure I can find. Oh yeah, here it is. No, that's the pulse diagnosis book. I want to say it has like a blue cover. But I feel like recently, by recently I mean like 10 years ago, some people came out with some books on the divergent channels, and I feel like before that it's usually like the divergent channels have like one section in a textbook, so we don't necessarily learn a whole lot about that. And then there's the idea of like, how do you actually treat them, because we can only access points through the primary channels. About how do we treat them. Was I right, Charles and Mikishima? Yeah, because I thought I might be getting confused with somebody else. Let's just type in Mikishima and see what comes up. Oh, here we go. Yeah, an exposition on the 8 extraordinary channels. And I feel like, I'm not sure I read the whole thing. I think I at least flipped through it. And so that's kind of, we don't have a lot. I just feel like we don't have a lot of information on the 8 extras or on the divergent channels or how to use them in treatment. Ooh, sorry, I'm not very good with a mouse. I would say that I more focus on the primary channels. Maybe it's just because I take a more simplistic approach to treating my patients. I feel like I knew some people who in school who were just really big into on every treatment they wanted to open one of the 8 extraordinary channels, and I was kind of like, is that really necessary, especially if it's not really a deep something going on deeply. Oh, good. Geological talks about treating divergent channels. So that's good. So I think it's like they're starting to get more information, because I think, at least like when I went to school, it was always like this very mysterious thing about like, oh yeah, we have these divergent channels. They're there. They help explain the actions of the points, but we didn't really talk a whole lot about treating the divergent channels directly, and it's kind of like the only way to treat them was to use the upper uniting points. And so it could be that there's more information about that out there now, but I don't know. I feel like I take a very simplistic approach to it. I feel like there are also like pulses associated with each of the those, and we don't necessarily learn those. So I guess what I'm saying is I don't do a lot of that stuff, but that's because I'm a crappy practitioner. So that doesn't mean that other people shouldn't. Yeah, saying there's different approaches between Mikishima, Machiocha, and Jeffrey Ewan, and yeah, that I guess that wouldn't surprise, because I feel like this was something that would depend on your style and your, just because again I'm not sure how much classically is actually said about how to use those for treatment. I think it's kind of like when you look at the Nanjing, it says that the 8 extraordinary channels are there, they're like reservoirs, and then they say something about hitting a person with a rock. They don't elaborate a whole lot into it the same way that they elaborate on treatment methods with the primary channels. So it could be that different people, different traditions have different ideas about it, just because they kind of diverge, because we don't have a lot of solid foundational material about it. So I would imagine that's one of those things where different people say different things and they have very different methods about how to use it. So again, I'm talking about out of my ass. I don't actually know very much about this. All right, I think we'll call it there, because I'm getting tired and I want to go eat pizza and watch Star Wars, because that's what I do with my life now that we have more Star Wars. You should make a pretentious, yeah. Maybe that would be a good T-shirt with like the Chinese characters on it. You know, it's like I think that used to be a thing. It was like I had a teacher that he had a T-shirt that said "White Devil" on it, or Bai Guo or whatever, and it was in but it was in Chinese characters. So when people would just get random shirts with Chinese characters, like, do you actually know what that means? Maybe I should have a T-shirt that says "pretentious cunt" in Chinese. We'll have to figure out a good translation for that. And I'm trying to thinking what. I'll have to talk to Patrick about that. What would a pretentious cunt of Chinese medicine starter pack include? It'd probably just include all the classics and like specifically not have textbooks, not have modern textbooks. I don't know. All right. I'm going to take my sweaty armpits and say have a good weekend. I think we're not going to do one next week. I think my dad's coming to visit, so I think that's going to be on a Friday, so we'll not do it next week. Maybe we'll try to pick up the week after. Maybe I'll try to actually make another podcast. I've been having problems with podcasting people lately, but maybe I'll try to fish for some more people to be on the podcast. YouTube videos might be difficult to come by because I want to focus on the formula thing. So if you want to see what's going on with my formulas, I'm right now just posting that to the Patreon, and then once it gets all completed, I'll package it into a course. But if you want to see those as they're being made, we'll put that on the Patreon. In the meantime, thanks for being here. Sorry I'm tired and grumpy. It's been a long week. So this was like, I feel like maybe every live stream is a grumpy live stream. So, Make a shirt that says Chinese medicine is real medicine. I remember when I was in school, somebody made a t-shirt that said, like, it just had a line from nipple to nipple and it said "Eat soon." I thought that was a funny shirt. I want to make one of those. All right. Thanks for being here. Have a good weekend. We'll see you in a little bit.